Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. This is a story about what if Deku had pink-tinted bandages part 1. If you guys enjoy this what if and want to see part 2, comment down below and let me know before I start. Please do support for more awesome content and leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel and also share this video with your friends and check out the description in my playlist. The author of the story QuirkQuartz from Wattpad. So let's start the video. Fair warning, this is one part fanfic, one part writing exercise. It'll deviate from the canon a bit, but overall the story will be pretty recognizable. So, sorry if you're not up for this. If you are, then let's take a look at what's what, shall we? It wasn't long after returning to the classrooms that Midoriya noticed the bandages, previously wrapped firmly around his shattered arms, were slipping, loosening the grip they had around his recently healed limbs. He had tried tightening them himself, but since both his hands were totally battered, he had no success with this. Fighting Todoroki had left him absolutely beaten and broken, literally, struggling to even move his fingers until they had recovered. Even after recovering thanks to Recovery Girl's quirk, he was still having trouble getting the feeling back into his fingers. Previous experience had taught him that he would need a short while before he would be able to feel the nerves in his hands fully again. He decided that he'd have to go to see Recovery Girl again before he left today, so she could see if she could fix the bandages. The last thing he needed was his arms breaking again because he'd not bothered to get the faulty healing appendages looked at. He was already on slippery terms with the school nurse due to his overuse of his quirk, and he didn't want to have to report to her the next day with another injury, particularly after the warning she had given him. Coincidentally, the broken boy had arrived at his classroom door at the same time as another one of his classmates. The girl in front of him seemed to have just reached the door handle herself when she must have heard his footsteps from further down the corridor, as she turned her head in curiosity to see who it was, even though she had her hands on the classroom door handle. Ashido, one of the classmates the awkward teenager hadn't spoken to particularly often. She wasn't an easy girl to miss either, which made their lack of interaction somewhat more bizarre. Pink skin and equally pink, and messy hair, horns atop her head, and black sclera in her eyes, finished by yellow irises that stood out like a firework against the night. She wasn't the kind of person you saw every day. She had changed from her gym clothes to the standard school uniform, as had Midoriya, although certain liberties had to be made thanks to the bandages he now wore. He had to wear his school jacket like a cloak around his neck, as opposed to Ashido, whom was able to properly and, surprisingly, given her personality, neatly. Upon seeing him, Mina seemed to smile at him, removing her hand from their classroom's humongous door's handle and waved to him energetically, despite him being only a few meters away from her. Midoriya. Not having spoken to her too much before, Midoriya broke into a small sweat, not too sure how to proceed with conversing with Ashido. Based on what little he knew about her, she was very sociable, energetic, and informal. He took a short intake of air before he responded, his wobbly smile forming in one corner of his mouth. Hey, Ashido-san. One had to question how he was nervous when it came to interacting with people he'd not known all that well. For God's sake, he'd taken on villains, and had just a few hours ago, basically dared, and forced Todoroki to shoot freaking fire, at him. How did he even possess the ability to be nervous when talking to his classmate? Ashido seemed to beam at his response, skipping over to him, and turning heel when she lined up next to him. There was just a short space between Midoriya and the door, so it hadn't really made a difference. You doing okay? I guess the best I can be, considering, Midoriya responded. Aside from the broken bones that were healing up, and reeling from the loss he had suffered, he was actually feeling okay about things. He wasn't entirely sure how they would pan out over the next few days, but he felt oddly optimistic about them. Good. Another bright smile came from the pink-skinned girl. Midoriya could dare say that her smile was contagious, because he found himself smiling just a little as the two of them interacted. He liked Ashido okay enough. She seemed to be a nice, if overzealous, sort of person. Their lack of conversation up until this point made it hard to guess if she was trying to get something out of him, or if she was just genuinely trying to have a pleasant conversation with him, not that it was unwelcome. The girl's mannerisms and actions seemed to suggest the latter, which Midoriya openly welcomed. You need me to get the door for you? If you don't mind, no sweat? Ashido took a few quickened steps forward and flung the door open a bit faster than need be, and holding it open so Midoriya could step through with minimal difficulty. He thanked the hyperactive girl as he walked past her, and she made her way to her seat, taking special care to not upset Bakugo, as Midoriya was convinced the blonde boy would actually kill him if he pissed him off, given the furious glare he was giving the wall. With his first-place medal still hanging from his mouth, Midoriya took his own seat behind the raging explosive quirk user, resting his shattered arms on the desk the best he could, trying not to upset the delicate hold the bandages had wrapped around him. He was more than aware of some of the looks his classmates were giving him. His fight had been, to many, the highlight of the entire festival, even more so than the finals, within their group, anyway. They'd all seen Midoriya fight in a way they had never seen before, throw himself into the fray with no regard for his well-being in a way none of them had expected, and had gone toe-to-toe with the person everyone had considered to be the single strongest person in their entire class, and push him to the point of breaking his one rule of never using the pyrokinetic aspect of his quirk, and nearly beaten him. Even when he was supposed to be taking Todoroki down, he had displayed that altruism that everyone knew him for, despite it having been none of his business to do so. It was a side that no one had ever expected someone as meek as Midoriya to display. The gutsy part of him. That part of him that thought nothing of broken bones, shattered hands and bloody knuckles in the pursuit of victory and assisting those who needed it. His classmates couldn't help but at least give him a second glance. Ashido in particular staring at him a bit longer than most others were, although Midoriya didn't notice this particular detail. It wasn't long before Aizawa came into the room, still wrapped up like a mummy in the bandages he had received from the USJ fight, and announced, "Due to the nature of the Sports Day Festival, you'll have tomorrow and the next day off to recover." It actually came as a surprise to the inheritor of One for All that UE would allow their students time off, even in these circumstances. Part of him actually felt disappointed about it, now more motivated than ever to learn, to train, to become a hero. But when he remembered the state he was in, he resigned that it probably was for the best. Today was Wednesday, meaning the days the class had off were Thursday and Friday. The weekend rolled in after that, totaling up at a 4-day break from attending classes. In middle school, such a lengthy break would have called for a celebration, and would have made the classmates he had back then too happy to bother bullying him for his lack of a quirk. Thinking back on it, Midoriya wondered if any of his former classmates had watched his participation in the events today. For the elite students of Class 1A, however, a 4-day grace period before they could get back to work almost felt like a kick in the teeth. Each and every one of them had signed up for the hardest tasks and to keep pushing themselves both physically and academically in order to become the very best they could be. Being told that they couldn't do to this was almost saddening. But none of them complained, at least vocally. They all knew they needed the rest, deep down, though they may not have liked to admit it. Some of them had injuries that needed time to recover. Some of them, particularly Todoroki, with the family issues he suffered regularly, and Ida, wherever he was right now, had emotional issues they had to clear up before they could return to give it their optimum efforts. This was for the best. A few days or boredom was preferable to failing their classes for the next couple days. Students raised from their seats, filtering out of the room once they had acquired their belongings, some leaving far more vocally and explosively than others, until it was just Uraraka and Midoriya trying to tighten up what he could of the bandages, and Uraraka looking at him like he'd just gone feral. The fact the white material was now in his mouth between a set of clenched teeth didn't do anything to help the messy green-haired boy's image. Deku? The zero-gravity quirk holder asked, concerned, "What the heck are you doing?" Midoriya only just realized that his friend had been stood there with her mouth slightly ajar at his curious behavior, watching him, from an outsider's perspective, attempt to chew off the medical equipment designed to aid his recovery. "Oh, the bandages are sort of loose. I'm just trying to keep them from falling off." His awkward reply was only amplified thanks to him talking without removing said bandages from his mouth. Realizing this only embarrassed him further, so he allowed the object to fall from his mouth, and awkwardly smiled at his friend. I'm going to see Recovery Girl, and I kinda don't want her to yell at me." He laughed quietly, knowing it wasn't really that funny. Thankfully, Uraraka knew how shy and awkward he was, and accepted his reasoning and silly actions reasonably quickly. Mercifully, she moved along with the conversation, sparing Midoriya and further embarrassment. Do you want me to wait for you? That's okay. You go on ahead. I'd like to think about some things on my own if that's okay. Okay, Deku. The brown-haired girl nodded at him, adding on her affectionate nickname for him. Make sure not to fall over on your way there. That would hurt a lot, Midoriya thought, shivering at the prospect. Alright, thanks. Sometimes, he really wished that his friend would think before she spoke, if only for his own reassurances. With that, she left him alone in the classroom. Once she was gone, he let out a long-winded sigh. The truth was, he just felt like being alone for a little while. Just to let himself contemplate the day gone by. He picked himself up and made his way to Recovery Girl's office. She wasn't happy to see him back again so soon after sending him out of her office with a slap on the wrist and a warning. She honestly had expected, knowing Midoriya, that he had broken his body once again trying to save someone or something equally dumb and selfless, like getting a cat out of a tree. She was almost prepared to chase him out of the room while wielding a nearby rigid piece of equipment, but once he managed to stutter out his reason for being here, she quickly calmed down and tended to the bandages in silence. There was a certain sense of calm that befell Midoriya when Recovery Girl never questioned him about his quirk. She knew everything. About All Might. About One for All. About his previously quirkless nature. It felt good to not have to hide that from her. That at least one person knew about who he really was. He appreciated and respected Recovery Girl as a member of Yui for just that reason. Although he had to admit, she was a very stubborn sort of person when she wanted to be. Her refusal to treat his injuries any further left him in a bad position, either stop using One for All, suffer the large recovery time it would take to heal from his quirk's backlash naturally, or find a better way to handle said power. The first two were totally out of the question. And he wasn't sure how to go about doing that last one. He had felt he was making steady, if painful, progress to achieving better control over his bestowed power. That had partly been in thanks to the knowledge he could be healed if he became injured. That service now stripped away from him, he wasn't sure how to proceed. Thanking Recovery Girl, Midoriya left the nurse's office, his bandages now firmly secured, and began to make his way off of the school premises. Glancing at the clock, he saw that he had missed his usual train ride back home, or more accurately, there was no way he'd be able to get there in time in his current state. A new train came at 1/4 every hour. He wouldn't be waiting for too long, so it wasn't like it would be a huge problem. He'd only just gotten past the gates of the school perimeter when he heard his name being called out from behind him, along with the crunching sounds of rapid footsteps. Midoriya. Wait you. Quickly turning around, mostly on reflex, Midoriya was just in time to see what he could only describe as a pink blur skidding to a half on the heels of her shoes, kicking up a bit of a dust cloud that caught onto the young hero in training's uniform, so he had to shield his eyes to prevent any debris from hitting his eyes from it. Ashido-san. Yep. Ashido confirmed, standing up on her tiptoes so she was just that tiny bit higher than her male classmate. Without this small boost in her height, she stood just a couple of inches shorter than her male classmate, even with her horns included. We seem to keep running into each other a lot today. This was the second time, but Midoriya kept that thought to himself. You headed to the subway now. Her mouth was running at a mile a minute, requiring her conversation partner to need a second to process the words she had said and put them into a complete sentence before he could make an appropriate, if short, response. Wise. Mind if I tag along with you? A sure thing. He would have preferred to walk alone, to go over the day's fights in his head, but he would have felt a lot ruder if he just turned her away when she had so kindly asked him. He decided in that split second that it wouldn't be that bad to go with her. They were both heading to the same location anyway, so it wasn't like he could avoid her even if he wanted to. Ashido cheered by throwing her hands into the air in an overly dramatic fashion, and jumping in line with Midoriya once again. The two of them walked in sync, Ashido leading most of the conversation. Your fight with Todoroki was amazing. You were all like bam bam bam. And Todoroki was like boom boom boom. With each one of her short but accurate descriptive words, she threw a punch in the air in front of her, expelling all that pent-up energy she seemed to generate at a rapid scale. It was super intense. Why, it was pretty tense, huh? The loser of the battle she was describing agreed. It had been a very tense fight, although he had been in a ton of pain for each second of it. It was totally cool how you forced him into using his firepower. I've never seen him push that far before. You're really strong. You think so? Yeah, dude. Not even those villains back at USJ could force him to use his fire. I thought he was the strongest in our class for sure. Ashido swayed her hips from side to side, her skirt following as she did so. He tilted her head and leaned forward, so she could clearly look at the face of her classmate. I'm starting to think it might be you now. Midoriya laughed awkwardly, a bead of sweat running down his forehead. An example of Ashido's excitable and over-enthusiastic nature. I wouldn't go that far. I mean, it took its toll on me. I had to push myself to the limits to even get him to use his fire, and he beat me in one move with it. Folding her arms and puffing out her cheeks, Ashido looked straight ahead, like she was thinking very hard about what to say in response to that. It wasn't really a statement she could argue with, since the fight had left Midoriya with broken bones once again. She almost could have looked like she was sulking if she hadn't spoken up again with, "Your quirk really is strange, you know? Every time you use it your body breaks. It's weird, you know. And it sucks too. It's such a strong power. It's like if my acid burned me every time I used it." Comparing their quirks wasn't the best subject, not that she knew that fact. While Ashido was born with her power, Midoriya's had been passed down to him. But he understood the logic of what she was saying, and from an outside perspective, it would seem peculiar that his own quirk violently harmed him like it did from only one use. It would be more understandable if it happened over multiple uses, like a drawback to pushing past his limits, like Uraraka's nausea or Todoroki's frostbite from overusing their respective powers, but from a single use. Midoriya couldn't blame Ashido for thinking that his quirk was strange. I guess so. Ha. He laughed a bit louder and more obviously forced than he would have ever liked to have in any conversation with literally anyone. He even got a few odd glances from some of the people walking past the two UE students, as well as Ashido. Surprisingly enough though, she didn't seem to think too much of it. She just shrugged her shoulders, readjusting her heavily decorated backpack, and smirked, glancing at him with her yellow iris from the corner of her eyes. "So it's not just you that's strange, but your power is too." What do you mean by that? I just found it odd that someone who has such an awesome quirk could be so wimpy that elicited a genuine laugh from Midoriya, albeit an awkward one, since Ashido had technically insulted him. He was certain she didn't mean any offense though. She was a bit like Azui in that respect. You don't mince your words, dude. But when you try to help people, you suddenly become this badass fighter. This was the first time that Midoriya outright blushed at the compliments that were being thrown at him by the pink-haired girl. Sure, he'd been red in the face basically the entire time, but that was par for the course with him whenever he received such praise. This was an outright blush that warmed his cheeks. I don't think there's a lot of people who could throw themselves at an enemy when they know that they'll definitely break their bones. I think it's super cool. Unsure how to respond to that, Midoriya just smiled to himself as both he and Ashido walked down the steps to the subway lines. He felt really good about himself right now. All his life, he'd wanted to be a really cool, calm, and inspiring hero to people who could watch him and think, "That's such a cool hero." Hearing that compliment from someone who had watched him fight and said this themselves, Midoriya just didn't know how to express his gratitude. His warm red blush now covered his freckles, masking them in a surrounding of scarlet, and he felt his heart rate quickening just that bit faster. Upon the inspection of the train times, Ashido let out a long groan as her head slumped forward, her arms limp at her sides, like every time Midoriya broke his arm. "Oh, am I in? I missed my train. I'm gonna be here a geez." Glancing at the timetable, Midoriya saw that his own train was due in just a few minutes. The next one wouldn't be arriving for another hour if he missed it, so he didn't want to stay around, but he felt bad for Ashido. What number is your train?" Ashido glanced at Midoriya before she took another look at the timetable to get the number again. 372. Smiling, Midoriya informed her, "There's a train with that number that leaves from my home station actually. I think it sets off sooner than the one here. Pure luck, as it were. Pure luck that Midoriya just happened to be the person Ashido had been walking with, and that he was the sort of person who just happened to remember all this random trivia. Really? The pink girl's black eyes somehow seemed to sparkle at Midoriya's sentence. The life seemed to have been shot back into her at the base of the spine, a very rapid turnaround from just a few moments ago. Taking just a second to make sure he wasn't wrong, the green-haired boy did a quick run-through of all the trains that he saw at his local subway station each and every day. Let me think. I normally get on the train that I missed today that leaves at around 4 p.m. and arrives at home about half an hour later. I leave and get onto the station, and there's always a line of trains to the right-hand side. He began his usual muttering that he did whenever deep in thought, which earned him an odd look from the girl with the acid quirk, since this was the first time she had seen his legendary muttering in person. Nodding his head, he reaffirmed his statement. Yep, I'm sure of it. It leaves about 5 minutes after my train gets back. I'm pretty sure it takes a faster route too. You're kidding? Ashido seemed to bounce up and down with excitement over this new information she was being presented with. She was almost like a kid at Christmas opening a new gift. Can I travel with you then? When Midoriya nodded his head, what else could he do? Say no, turn heel and run for it. Ashido had to physically stop herself from hugging the boy, and she came very close to doing so, before she remembered his multiple shattered limbs. Instead, she just placed her hands on his shoulders and continued to bounce up and down in her trademarked zeal. You're the best, Midori. He had to blush at that name. When had he turned from Midoriya to Midori? He didn't let the thoughts of that cloud his mind for too long, since he had to lead his classmate to the train that he normally captured back home before it departed from the station and left them both stranded on the station in the middle of Tokyo. They had to run a bit of the last leg of their journey to Midoriya's normal platform, since there were so many people using the subway that day, many of them most likely spectators from the Yui Sports Festival. Once on the train with just a few seconds to spare, both the students both caught their breath and shared a small laugh at how hectic the trip to their train had been. They both found a set of empty seats that they both sat at, Ashido insisting that Midoriya take the window seat, since he was still injured, and engaged in further conversation with one another. Being within close proximity to the girl led Midoriya to a few observations he may not have otherwise made when it came to Ashido. First and foremost, he noticed that she had a very unique scent to her, and while thinking that sentence alone was enough to make Midoriya blush, he realized it was most likely akin to the type of shampoo she applied to her hair. Bubblegum and citron. That's what he first thought of when he first caught scent of it. Secondly, was that she had a very pretty smile. Being so close to her, Midoriya was able to note her smile seemed to brighten up the entire subway. It was infectious, as though no choice of his own, he found himself smiling alongside her, for no reason whatsoever. It would have made him blush were the grin on his face not taking up the space that he had to do so. The girl also possessed more energy than Midoriya even knew a single person could contain. She was the sort of person who would look out the window and become enthused by a new brick texture that had some colorful graffiti spray painted onto it. Taking a few seconds out of their conversation to check the hero news, as he always liked to do on his journeys to and from school, Midoriya scanned over a few articles that were currently trending. Nothing on Ida's brother, he noted. It wasn't surprising, since it was a very recent development, but still, he worried for his friend. Hey Midoriya. What about your arms? When will they be healed? Recovery girl said to leave them on today and tomorrow and then I can take them off when I wake up on Saturday. He didn't take his eyes off his phone as he read a story about a thug who used a quirk that allowed him to turn his body into grass to fight off the custody enforcement officers during a chase. Sue, what are you going to be doing for our time off? Ashido asked, leaning over her classmate's shoulder to see what he was reading. Her voice was a lot closer to his ears than he was used to when she did this, which caused him to jump back a bit from her. His hand containing his phone now rested on his lap, and he looked up to face the pink-skinned girl. There wasn't really an answer he could give without giving away the sheer levels of hardiness that he exhibited, so he just decided to be honest. I guess just studying. Is that all you do? A raised eyebrow came alongside the response. Suddenly he felt embarrassed. Did he seriously give off the sort of impression that all he did was sit in his room and study all day? Did all his classmates have that mental perception of him? What else do you do then? I lift weights? It was more like a question than it was a statement, and even then, it was a fairly mediocre response at best. From anyone else, it would sound like he was attempting to boast about his weightlifting, whereas with Midoriya, it was probably the furthest thing from what he was doing. It almost sounded like he was pitying himself. You don't go out and just do stuff for fun a lot, huh? Ashido sounded almost sympathetic, sad nearly, like she just found out a little kid she had been looking after had never been to a theme park. I guess not. Since before he had even enrolled in Yui Academy, Midoriya had barely had any free time to do anything he normally considered fun. His pastimes before All Might had thrown his working regime at the quirkless hero admirer had involved reading from his impressive collection of superhero comics and reading about various pro-heroes online. He hadn't gotten out much, even when he had had every opportunity to do so. He attributed it to his lack of friends due to growing up without a quirk. No one wanted much of anything to do with him because of it. He hadn't had a reason to go out and experience anything like that in his life. It wasn't something that particularly bothered Midoriya. Not that he opposed the concept of just having fun with friends for a few hours at a carnival or something along the lines, but in all honesty, all he had ever wanted to do as a child was prepare for when he grew up and became a hero. It had been a one-track life for him so far, but he couldn't begin to think of any other way he'd wanted to spend his childhood. Aside from maybe having a quirk. I know what you need. Ashido acted without warning and snatched the phone straight out of Midoriya's hands. With honestly impressive speed, she flipped out her own phone and began running through her contacts while scanning through Midoriya's. She noticed that on the list of contacts he had, the only two he had favored were his mother's and Uraraka's. After quickly typing in her own number and getting Midoriya's number for her own phone, she took the liberty of marking herself as a favorite on the boy's phone, her name now at the top of his contact list since her name was alphabetically the earliest in his favorites list. She also made note to add 2 wave symbols at the start and end of her name before she gave the boy his phone back. Stunned by the immensely fast interaction, Midoriya had to confess, he was amazed with just how speedy she was when it came to mobile technology when she wanted to be. She had only had hold of his phone for about 10 seconds before she was handing it back to him with a new contact logged into it. What the dash, your bandages come off Saturday, right? Ashido stood up suddenly. Glancing around, Midoriya was amazed that he hadn't noticed the train had stopped, at his usual station no less. He struggled up, but kindly, his fellow student helped him out of his predicament with a fond smile. We should hang out. The horned girl held up her phone for the plain-looking boy to see, covered in a glittery silver phone case with a bunch of colorful stickers and buttons attached to it. I've got your number, so I'll text you later. She didn't give the confused boy enough time to respond before dashing off, apparently deciding that she could find her train from here, despite having never been to this station before. Catch you later, Midori. Wait a second. Midoriya called out, but Ashido was already off the train and lost in the crowd of people. You don't even know where your train leaves from, she tried to call out, but as he finished the sentence, his words got quieter and quieter before he just eventually stopped talking. Blinking hard a few times, he inquired himself, what the hell had just happened? Contemplating this very understandable question, alarmed by an announcement, he had to run off of the train before the doors sealed and he ended up somewhere in the central Tokyo district. That had been a dramatic change of pace, to say the very least. He knew Ashido was impulsive and bombastic when it came to her energy and social interactions, but that had been an unpredictable move. He barely even knew Ashido, and now she was asking him to hang out with her during their time off. And she'd run for it before he could say no. Yes. She'd just dashed off before he could fully comprehend what she had said to him, now lost in that sea of people, unable to be found, no matter how much she stood out. Mixed into the crowd of brown trench coats and colorful dressed. He sighed, hoping that she'd find her way around okay. He would have happily shown her to her station if she'd just waited for him, but evidently, patience wasn't the biggest virtue of Ashido's. It wasn't that the platform was particularly difficult to navigate or anything, but he worried that since it was her first time. In this area, she might get turned around. Then again, she seemed to have a talent for figuring things out, however unorthodox those solutions may be. Curious, he unlocked his phone and swept through his contacts. And he blushed when he saw what name Ashido had put her number as. Mina, 7 times. Can you believe it? Nope. Doing his best to hold his fork in his bandaged hand, Midoriya attempted to jab his cutlery into the freshly cooked egg his mother had served him. His grip wasn't as firm as he would have liked, so his fork ended up skidding across to the other side of the plate, as opposed to scooping up the piece of food. Without the use of his other hand, he couldn't cut up his dinner, nor could he use a knife to scoop the sustenance onto his fork. DMN. His mother was talking to him about the number of times she had fainted during the Sports Day festival. Broadcast worldwide, it was a very popular, reoccurring success every time it came around. Midoriya had watched it with his mother many times before his enrollment into the prestigious Yui Academy, fascinated and enamored by all the amazing quirks and heroes in training competing in the event. He dreamed, but never truly thought that he could be a part of it someday. I fainted 7 whole times during the cavalry battle. And the last 2 were from dehydration. You even did better than me in that department. Midoriya attempted another jab at his meal, but with the same results. His mother sometimes over-exaggerated, but judging by the literal mountain of tissues that he'd found nearly enwrapped by when he came through the front door, he wasn't inclined to disbelieve her. To be honest though, he was only half listening. He had way too many things on his mind. Namely, One for All, and Ashido-sen. The pink girl had invaded his thoughts even when back home, the conversations they had engaged in, the laughter they had shared, and the journey back to the familiarity of his neighborhood. She had managed to systematically make her way into his thoughts while back at home, and dealing with his hypersensitive, caring mother. Midoriya wasn't sure how she had managed that. Ashido completely juxtaposed the entire way he had grown up. His place of raising had been a place that had felt dark, oppressive, and downright imprisoning at times throughout his childhood. The bullying, the teasing, the bitter disappointment and heartbreak he felt of being quirkless, though it had been no fault of her own. His mother had done everything in her limited power to brighten up his world, but in the end, she had just allowed him to remain in the darkness that he seemed to keep crawling back into, hoping that one day, things would get better for him. They had, of course, and his mother had wept maybe 3 buckets worth of tears when he came home that day and told her about his quirk. But for the most part, the place felt just so empty to Midoriya. But Ashido, her very existence was in opposition to the conditions in which he had grown up in. She was so bright and cheerful, she could make the nighttime seem like a dimmer 𝐓𝗡 at a disco rave. Even her pigmented skin was bright and colorful. The freedom with which she carried herself was like nothing Midoriya had ever seen. She never seemed to hold back, or even really know how to. Throw something at her, and Ashido would go at it with pretty much everything she could manage with no regrets and a smile on her face, unless it was an academic paper, of course. Maybe it was all those things that made her stick to his thoughts like glue when he returned to his home. I know you told me your quirk manifested so unexpectedly, but why does it have to be such a dangerous power? His mother said with a sigh, a worried look plastered on her face. I support you, Izuku. Of course I do, but you still make your poor mother worry. Right, sorry, and that was the other thing. His power just wasn't stable enough to keep going the way he was. He could barely contain the boundless energy of One for All within his fragile body, with no idea how to proceed with how to begin learning to control it. He'd thrown a few 5% punches, but that wasn't to say that he knew how he'd even managed it in the first place. They'd been accidents. Coincidence. Luck of the draw, as it were. He needed a better way. A way that didn't involve him being a glass cannon anymore. A way that meant he didn't have to rely on everyone else saving him all the time. A way that meant he didn't have to worry anyone anymore. Through diligence and determination, he'd improved his intellectual capabilities and academia in order to enter U. Through bravery and a willingness to throw himself into the fray for the sake of others, he'd proven to everyone who ever doubted him that he could become a hero. Now he needed all those skills to learn how to utilize One for All, once and for all. Do you want to watch the videos? His mother asked Midoriya, her voice pepper and upbeat again. There in HD, living in their sets of flats, They rarely got HD video footage, since it was overly expensive. His mother had made an exception for her son's debut on the sports day. Midoriya considered for a moment, before he nodded. Yeah, I think I do. I want to see a fight I missed. Welp, this is the first chapter of the first My Hero Academia story that I'm putting out. I said it at the start, and I'll say it again. This is one part fanfic, the other part writing exercise. I'll be deviating from the canon in a few places, but overall, I'll be fairly close where it lies. Next chapter, I plan on focusing on Mina's perspective, which should certainly be a challenge and quite a bit of fun. Mina's obviously a favorite of mine, since she's both hilarious and adorable as hell, and I will freely admit I think she's the cutest DMing thing in all My Hero Academia. Fight me. I'ma write this whenever I'm bored and have a few moments to kill, so usually while I'm falling asleep and not reading White Rose from RWBY. It's more just a guilty pleasure thing more than anything else, so expect me to have a few ideas in there that I just really want to write. Hey, if people like this sort of thing, maybe I'll make another one that's a bit more out there. Who knows? I'm in a fairly happy place with my writing these days, so since I got a shout out from him, and because I freaking adore his work so I do this anyways, be sure to check out Secondary Vulpine's Urban Ultra story if you haven't already. Trust me, it's freaking hilarious, and it's apparently the only multiple chapter story of Mina X's 𝐒𝐿, so it's a win-win. Well, I like it anyway. You can find it 1FF.net or AO3. Either one works. Until next time guys. See ya. Mina wasn't exactly a morning person even at the best of times. Sure, she could normally handle a morning alright before she'd had her usual intake of caffeine that she required before she was really ready to start the day, but after the trial by fire that had been the UE Sports Festival that she'd been through yesterday, she felt perfectly justified in sleeping in the next morning. That was what the time off given to them had been for, right? To relax. To recharge. To replenish her normally unlimited energy. And also for the second and third years to have their days in the spotlight, but mostly for them to relax. So when she woke up, opening only one eye groggily, getting a small glimpse of her walls and roof, heavily decorated with photographs and posters of all sorts of things, she immediately closed it once again, yawned, and shuffled to a more comfortable sleeping position. Still, now she was awake, her thoughts began to come back to her. Yesterday had certainly been intense, but it had also been incredibly fun, as far as she was concerned. Sure, she'd lost, but she'd shown what she was made of to all the professionals. That had to be worth something, didn't it? She'd made it to the final events, even finished in the top 8. Top 8? That had been far more than she'd ever expected to achieve, especially with a quirk like hers. Granted, against 𝐒𝐭𝐚𝐲, her quirk had basically been useless, but she'd at least managed to give him a good fight. When given a matchup as bad as that, she couldn't really have asked for much more. And then there was Midori. She couldn't stop herself from smiling when she thought about that nickname she had given him. Pleasantly surprised that he hadn't seemed too uncomfortable with it, Mina decided that that was now her name for him. Like how Uraraka called him Deku, she would call him Midori. Mina had been perfectly aware as to how little they had spoken until yesterday. She was very much aware of that fact. She'd not made it a secret that she respected him as a classmate and a student, not even slightly hiding the admiration she had for his intellect and his attitude towards becoming a hero. Anyone would be hard-pressed to find someone in their class who didn't, if you excluded Bakugo, of course. But she really didn't know him all that well. In fact, she knew Todoroki better than she knew Midoriya, and she'd had perhaps 1.5 conversations with the half-hot half-cold quirk user. He was the strongest in their class, even without his fire powers. She had honestly been rooting for him when the match began. But how quickly her support had changed. She had become engrossed by the sheer levels of determination and the remarkable, indomitable will that meek, shy Midoriya had shown. He'd burst out of his shell like a hand grenade, and given the biggest display of strength and power of anyone there that day. She didn't care who disagreed with her on that, or what their reasons were. The Sports Day Festival belonged to Midoriya and his fight with Todoroki. But it was far more than that. They should have been fighting. But Midoriya had pushed their bi-hair-colored classmate, pausing aside what held him back. He'd made him use his fire powers. all while breaking his bones just to use his quirk, and even then he kept using it on his shattered arms to carry on a fight he couldn't possibly have won. How could she not have been inspired by that? She'd had to talk to him after that. She just had to. There wasn't any way that she couldn't say something to him. Seeing him walking alone had been her chance, and she had taken it gladly and without any hesitation. She was a social creature. It was in her nature to converse with people whenever she could, and she'd discovered that Midori made for entertaining company. Sure, he was a little awkward and a massive nerd, but she'd come to expect those things from the boy whose curly green hair rivaled her own pink mess in terms of curliness and presumed difficulty to make behave. Not that Mina ever really tried to get hers under control, much to her mother's chagrin. If her mother thought she would be able to tame the jungle that was Mina Ashido's hair, she clearly had no idea who she was dealing with. Another smile crept onto her face when she remembered the look of pure confusion that had taken over his face when she had swiped his phone and added her own details to it. He'd looked so confused, it was hilarious to think about. Suddenly, she found herself wide awake. Just thinking about yesterday had given her a shot of her trademarked energy. Her eyes shot open, and she threw her duvet to the side. Checking her phone, she was a bit disappointed to not see a message or anything of the sort from Midori, but she didn't let it bother her. She had thrown out the prospect of hanging out at the weekend rather suddenly, so she didn't hold it against him. Making note that the time was a lot later than she normally would rise from her slumber, 11:30, she decided to let her family know she was up and about. She didn't bother changing out of her sleepwear, which consisted of a pair of cute purple short shorts that only covered up half of her thighs, and a black t-shirt that had a pink inscription written on it in a fancy font that Mina didn't know the name of. It read, in bold capital, whatever the hell font this was, Pinky. What a classy birthday gift her brother had gotten her. Swinging the door open, Mina stepped barefooted out of her room in onto the landing, with a song in her heart and a smile on her face. Only to instantly regret this decision a second later when she trod onto a piece of Lego she hadn't seen. God damn it, Mika. If her family hasn't figured out that she was awake before, the cry of pain had definitely given her away. Treading on Lego barefoot was the single most painful experience that anyone could be subjected to, Mina thought as she hissed loudly. She wasn't sure what cosmic deity she had angered for this to be how her day started, but oh ho boy, was she going to give it a reason to be angry by the time she had finished with it. Mina. Oh good, here was Mika now. Shooting a glare at her younger sibling, Mina made note of how much of a grin her little sister had on her face right now. Like she had planned this. Or perhaps Mika had put the idea into her impressionable little head, who knew? Either way, Mina grabbed the small girl's head in one hand in a claw-like motion, and began to apply pressure to her sibling's temple very slowly. Not enough to cause serious pain, but enough to get a reaction. Mina had done this many times, and the rest of the family just tended to let it happen. Apparently it was now just how the pink girl solved family disputes. Mika, sis, could you please remind me how many times I've asked you not to leave your Lego outside my door? Mina asked with a pained and forced smile, her pink hair covering her pitch-black eyes. 6. Her sister phrased it more like a question than she did an answer. She didn't seem particularly bothered by her sister's grip around her skull. Perhaps she had developed some immunity to it. 6. Mina repeated, her pained smile still stuck to her face. So why is there still Lego outside my bedroom door? I dunno. Her sister's response was way too cheerful for Mina's liking. She was convinced Mika enjoyed pulling these pranks on her. She loved her little sister dearly, she did, but this was one of those times where she really felt like throwing her down a flight of stairs. Can you move them, sis? Mina sighed, letting go of her sister's head. She needed caffeine. Mika started collecting the tiny plastic building blocks and carrying them away to her bedroom, far out of reach of the acid quirk user. Good job too, because Mina had been on the verge of dissolving them with the most corrosive acid that she could generate. Another yawn escaped Mina's mouth, one she didn't even bother attempting to suppress. Small tears welled up in her eyes, which she rubbed away quickly before going to get her morning coffee. She made the trip downstairs and to the kitchen, the cold tiles on the floor sending a shiver right up her bare feet and up to the rest of her body. The fact her sleepwear left little to be desired didn't help the sudden chill she had. Not that that mattered at all. That part was just a psychedelic perception. She only noticed. Her father saw on the sofa that they kept in their kitchen, with a newspaper in hand, when she reached the coffee machine, and hit the button to make herself a fresh cup. While a lot of people now got their news from the internet, her father claimed to prefer the more traditional methods, at least when he was stirring over his morning brew. Upon realizing that his daughter was in the room, he peeked over the top of the paper. "Look who decided to join us from beyond the grave." "Morning to you too, Dad." Mina smiled at her father. Like everyone else in her family, she shared a good, yet back-and-forth comedic relationship with her father. She was certain that he was where she got her sense of humor from, since they shared a similar taste in jokes and in blunt humor. Glancing around the room, the pink girl questioned, "Where are Mika and Mara?" Mika took them both to a new movie. That one Mara's been looking forward to. How her older brother could stand those god-awful films their younger sibling enjoyed was beyond Mina. She suspected that there was a bit more to it than that, since she knew Mika wasn't a huge fan of those films either. Guy time. Guy time. It basically translated to them going to the arcade afterwards, gorging themselves on fattening takeout foods, and spying on what women they thought looked attractive. Creeps. Rolling her eyes, Mina heard the chime that indicated that the pot was ready. She reached for her mug, covered in colorful scribbles and childish drawings she had done when she was younger, and filled it up to the brim. Thankfully, she didn't need to waste time with adding in her usual additions like milk and sugars, since the machine did it all for her. If she had the levels of sugar that she normally wanted by default, she would probably have ended up with type 2 diabetes by the time she was 12. Taking a sip, she felt the life and energy shoot right back into her like a lightning bolt. Still, that didn't stop it from scalding her tongue. She quickly used her hand like a fan to cool down her face, wafting it up and down as fast as one could possibly see, and making a pained expression on her face that her father couldn't help but chuckle at. "Nice to see you enjoying my pain, Dad. It is amusing to watch you flail like a fish out of water, you human mess. I learned it from the best." Mina sighed and smiled. Her family really were the biggest bunch of jerks she knew, and she loved them for it. Her mother was normally out of the house for the majority of Thursdays, working at some job in the main city that Mina had never bothered to ask about. It was only a recent employment, and considering everything that had gone down at UE, it hadn't been at the forefront of her thoughts. Her father worked in medicine at a good establishment that could offer time off for their employees during the working week. Something about more productivity during working hours over total working hours. Whatever it was, Mina's father loved the job he did, so when he did have to go to work, he never was upset or ticked off about having to do so. So that left her and her 3 siblings. Mika, Mika and Mara. And Mina. Mina, Mika, Mika, Mara. The pink girl was convinced that her family had been trying to name them so they could start a barbershop quartet group with rhyming names. Mina was the second oldest in her family, Mika being just a year older than her. He didn't get into UE, though he had tried, and failed the year before Mina had applied. He didn't seem too bitter about it though, so she shared a good relationship with him, even if he did like to tease her about anything he could think of. Her pink skin was one thing he liked to target. In turn, she made fun of his skinny demeanor. Seriously, Mina was packing more muscle than he was, and he was actively trying to get some meat on his bones. They always found something to make fun of about each other. As for Mika and Mara, Mika being 10, while Mara was just 2 years Mina's junior, while she loved them both, they did seem to take a particular pleasure in making Mina's life as painful as possible. The Lego incident seemed to happen, on average, at least once a week. But that was just a small fragment of the stresses they brought. Taking her chargers, since they seemed to never know where their own went missing, messing with her school papers because they wanted to read them, playing with her phone when she left it unsupervised because she apparently had all the cool games on her device. She locked the DMN device anyway. How did they even find out about the games she had? Still, that was the ragtag state of the Ashido family. Blunt and bickering, but continuously loving and joking. Mina took another, this time a longer drink of her coffee. This time, she'd managed to chug the entire mug of her Kickstarter liquid. She let out a satisfied sigh before leaving the mug on the counter and heading back up to her room to get changed. She kept a sharp eye out for any pain-inducing pieces of plastic as she did so, not wanting to end up with another Lego piece lodged inside her skin. Just one more time, Mika, and I'm throwing it in hydrochloric acid. Now that she was filled with caffeine, she contemplated that there was for her to do today. She was awake now, but there didn't seem to be a whole lot for her to do today. Debating her options, she supposed she could rummage through Mitch's room and steal a few of his comics to read through. Not like she had anything better to do. There was also the games she and her siblings shared in the living room. She could probably spend a few hours on any game of her preference before her siblings came back and inevitably outvoted her on their choice of game, which usually involved guns, cars and hookers. Again, creeps. In the end though, the choice wound up being taken from her. Just as she had changed into her clothing for today and settled for clocking in a few hours with a gamepad and one of the many games she and her siblings had collected, her phone began to play the jingle it played whenever she received a text message. For a brief second, she thought it might have been Midoriya or one of her schoolmates there to shatter her boredom. Instead, she found that it was a message from her mother, asking her if she could go into the city to pick up some supplies. Apparently her previous day of absolute exhaustion meant nothing to her mother. Good to know. While her mother could be as laid back as the rest of her family, she was a lot stricter at the same time, and Mina didn't feel like pissing her off too much. Letting out a small sigh, Mina supposed that there could be something vaguely interesting going on in the city. She speed-typed a reply, grabbed a set of earphones, loaded up one of her favorite rock artist tracks, threw on one of her many hoodies, and burst her way out of the house. Waking up so late, Mina wasn't surprised to find that the city was bursting with life when she got there. Even with the various loud strums and guitar riffs that her earphones were conveying with her choice in music, she could still hear the incomprehensible chattering of about 2,000 interchangeable conversations going on at once. Cars revving up engines at traffic lights, and skidding to a halt at the ones that denied them progress. The pavements were totally packed with people, some of them like her, boasting an inhumane appearance, all going to their various locations, work, school, friends, homes, shopping. Not that Mina could differentiate who was going where. Normally Mina loved the city. She loved being in the hustle and bustle of civilization. She just enjoyed being around people and experiencing the noises and the rush of the city. It was exciting to her, something that was totally unlike where she lived. It was a, relatively speaking, quiet place, especially when compared to Tokyo's rush hour. But today, she was here on a very simple mission. Gather things for her mother and then go back home. Maybe grab a milkshake. For personal consumption. Her mother was buying after all. Her logic amusing her, Mina let out a small giggle. Once again, technicalities won the day. This was what she'd be doing if Midori ever sent her a message, she remembered. It wasn't like they'd be going rock climbing or doing something extremely extravagant. They'd just be hanging out, like she'd claimed. She contemplated sending one first, to make sure that they each had the right number, and to provoke a response from the shy teenager, but decided against it, at least until she got home. Using her phone to send a text message while on this street was just asking to drop it and for it to shatter into about 40,000 pieces, and god damn it, she was not paying for another phone. She'd learned her lesson the last time. Mina hummed along with her music as she dove into the nearest store that she saw that sold the things her mother was after. She wandered down the aisles, occasionally glancing at her phone to double-check the list. Various vegetables, random rices, and tasteless tins of instant food. The message very specifically asked for the kinds of instant food that tasted awful. Mina had to wonder if her mother hated her at that point, since she knew very well which kinds of instant foods her daughter absolutely adored. They weren't the same food, the brands were different. The good ones were like a few yen more expensive for a reason, because they were actually good. Still, she resigned and picked up the crappy knockoff garbage instant noodles and threw them into the basket she had acquired. "We're in for a party tonight," the girl muttered to herself. None of what she'd been bought looked particularly appetizing. She knew that in middle school everyone complained about how awful the cafeteria food always was, but Mina never understood what they were talking about. The cafeteria food was awesome, especially compared to some of the awful recipes her mother tried to make. Yui's food was like a freaking restaurant in comparison to whatever the hell required 3 capped containers of wasabi sauce and half a shark's fin. Mina shuddered. She didn't think she'd be looking forward to going back to school more. Mina loved her mother and all, but she couldn't stand her cooking. At least not after she decided that she wanted to try and be more, quote, adventurous with her meals. She checked her phone once more, just making sure that she had gotten everything. Rice, soup, wasabi, a colorful collection of vegetables, yep, that was everything. Every single worrying and disturbing item that was on the list before she could put the device away. However, she felt her phone vibrate and heard the small chime it gave once again. Another message. Absent-minded, she slid her finger across the touchscreen to find her messages folder, expecting her father to be asking her to bring him back some sort of snack, or Mika, for God knew what. Her surprise couldn't have been more apparent, nor pleasant, when she saw that it came from a contact marked in her phone as Midori. She couldn't help but smile. Halfway through the day, and he'd finally decided to message her. Took him long enough. Reading through his message, if it was possible to stutter via text, Mina was certain that the green-haired boy had found it. As she read it, she put in the awkward pauses where he would put them in conversation almost automatically. Ashido-san, this is your number, right? Jay, just making certain. How did he even manage that? How was it even possible to be awkward via text? Mina just laughed aloud and quickly sent a reply back. It's me, Midori. What took you so long? Quickly, she made her way to the checkout system to pay for all of this food before someone could ask her to run an errand somewhere else in the city. Thankfully, there wasn't anyone else using the systems when she arrived, so she quickly threw her basket into the section reserved for them, tapped a few buttons on the touchscreen, and scanned the items in with newfound vigor, tapping her foot in time with the new song that had just come up on her playlist, and humming happily again. Once she had deposited all the items into the bagging area and paid for them, she felt her phone inform her of another message. I was sleeping. Recovery girl told me to take it easy over the next few days. So I didn't want to overexert myself, sleeping in until well past noon. Not something that the pink girl would have expected from Midoriya. That message made Mina pause for a second. Now that she thought about it, then it would actually make sense that he didn't want to injure himself any more than he already had done, and the best way to do that would be to avoid physical activity. Do you still want to hang out this weekend? It's fine if you don't want to, I'll understand. She sent the text with a bit more of a somber feeling in her heart, and picked up the plastic bag filled with foods, making her way out of the store. Of course, she couldn't blame Midoriya for not wanting to break his bones again. If given the choice, she probably wouldn't want to either. But she wouldn't lie and say that she hadn't been looking forward to seeing him again come Saturday. Making her way through the city, she was relieved to find that it seemed to have calmed down during the time she had been acquiring goods for her mother. The streets were still packed, but she could walk on the sidewalk without running into someone who was on their phone talking about their latest business rivals or whatever the heck they were on about. She bit her lip lightly as she considered what to do next. Seeing as it looked like her mother was going to be making vomit soup for dinner tonight, she contemplated getting a quick snack or something now to inevitably tide her over for the day's meal. She decided against it though. She just wasn't hungry enough to justify it. Remembering that she had been eager for a milkshake not too long ago though, she decided that made a reasonable substitute and made her way to the nearest location, which happened to be a personal favorite. The place that she went to was a corner KSQ store that was run by only a small number of employees. The store was called Shake, and instead of giving their customers a small selection of drinks and beverages, along the wall behind the counter were a huge variety of various sweets, chocolates, and the likes. They allowed their customers to choose a candy of some description, whereupon, using various bits of machinery, a few dollops of ice cream, and a blender, they would turn it into a milkshake for consumption. Perhaps aiding the fact that they sold so cheaply to boot, was the fact it was run by a tiny staff of college students. Mina made her order, taking an adventurous dive into a flavor that she hadn't tried before. The person behind the counter, whom resembled a human crossed with an eagle of some description, took the order and passed it along to another store worker, whom began work on crafting the beverage. Immediately, crafting these drinks often took a few minutes, so Mina found herself a seat, many scattered around the room, thoughtfully provided by the staff there. Darting her eyes around the room with her trademark zeal, Mina found endless entertainment in what was plastered to the walls, from the posters of various specials the store was doing, to what she assumed was a personal favorite band of the group there, to ads and other such things that the store must have been hired to post, so she was certainly preoccupied while she waited. The interesting surroundings were just another reason why she enjoyed this store. She'd only been sat down for a moment before her phone began to chime once again, and she knew it was Midoriya on the other end. Quickly scooping up her mobile device from her hoodie pocket, she did note that this message had come a lot later than the previous one had done. What she read made her smile though. "And no, I'll be fine. I was actually thinking that maybe it would be a good idea for us to get to know one another a bit better. I mean, we're both trying to become heroes, Ari. So it stands to reason that we might end up getting called to the same situation when we graduate and start answering calls around the place, so we'd need to be able to understand one another, right? Way to make dealing with me sound like a chore, Midori." Mina chuckled to herself. Did he really have a one-track mind when it came to becoming a hero? He made himself seem obsessed still. It was hard to argue with his dedication, if nothing else. "Jay, you want to meet outside Yui, main gate, about 1-ish. We could catch a subway or whatever and find something fun to do." "That sounds good." Still baffled by how he seemed to stutter even in text, Mina just smirked to herself. She'd have to make sure not to push him too much, but she could still see the two of them being able to have a lot of fun together. The social impulses of the acid quirk user bubbled up inside, leaving her looking forward to the weekend all the more. This was a good chance to get to know her classmate better. How couldn't she be excited? Her order was called up, and she raised her hand to take it, and managed to practically skip the way back home. What I do want to say to you guys is that the My Hero Academia fandom actually leaves some pretty solid feedback that I've been able to take into account. Me being comma heavy is kinda an OCD trait of mine, so I hope you can forgive that. Sorry to those of you who it annoys. But this story got 350 reads at the time I'm updating this on FFnet, and while that's straight up pathetic in terms of the numbers you'd need to create a popular story, I'm having so much fun writing this, I simply don't care. This'll be a tight-knit group of people who want to see this story for one of two reasons: -1, you're like me, and want to see more of Mina, or 2, again, you're like me, and are genuinely interested in this ship. So, I'll do my best to create something you enjoy. Happy face. Hope you all enjoyed, and I hope I'll see you all again soon. Happy face. Warning. 2 characters will be appearing who we have never actually gotten names for. The 2 who buddied around with Bakugo during the first few chapters of the story. Since we don't know their names, using the same naming system Horikoshi uses, I made my own. Hope it fits. Having broken his bones so frequently in recent memory, Izuku had developed a small ritual for whenever he was able to toss aside the much-hated castings that he had been enwrapped with so many times. It wasn't anything too extravagant. He didn't mark the occasion by lighting candles or playing music like some people might have done. Really, all he did was sit at the kitchen table and take off each casting independently, with his own hands. A symbol of the independence he would have to achieve in order to live up to the expectations All Might had set out for him. It might seem dumb to an outsider, but to Izuku, it meant the world to be able to free of the castings. While he struggled getting the first one loose, due to his other hand still being imprisoned by the casts, he managed to fumble his way into tearing off one of the straps, allowing the bandages around his right arm to fall off, making a small amount cluttering noise on the kitchen table, as some of the cutlery left over from the previous night remained there. Upon his arm finally being free, Izuku stretched out his DMNT arm, feeling his joints click back together after being cramped together for such an extended period of time. Slight disfigurement caught his eye when he saw his right hand, a scar cut clearly across the back of the now crooked hand. It was a serviceable hand, still capable of making a fist, holding a pencil, throwing a baseball, and everything in between, but appeal-wise, it certainly wasn't going to win any awards. That was the price he paid for going as far as he did against Todoroki. Izuku had no regrets about it. In time, he would forget that his hand was ever normal, and he'd grow used to the slightly wonky fingers and the unseemly scar. Getting the casting off his second arm was a far easier task now that he had access to opposable thumb. It never took him too long to do. Unwrapping and unlatching everything, The green-haired boy let out a sigh of relief when his left arm could now join the rest of his body in the feeling of fresh, clean, oxygen-rich air around them. Next came the leg cast, which he had off in about a minute. With the functionality of having two hands, getting out of a leg brace wasn't a challenge, by any stretch of the imagination. Each of his limbs free, 𝐒𝐻𝐽 decided to check to go through phase 2 of his little ceremony. Again, it wasn't anything incredible. All he did was walk over from the dining table to the fridge, testing to see how his leg was able to handle his body weight. Recovery Girl's quirk truly was amazing, and no matter how common an occurrence it was for the boy to end up having said quirk used on him, he'd never say anything less about it. The incredible ability had basically healed his leg once again. It had been enough to walk on for days, but the nurse had always been very insistent on him keeping on traditional castings to help defend his vulnerable limbs. He stretched off his leg, feeling the click once again. It was a lot rarer of an event for his legs to get broken, since he favored using arms to fight, but during his final leap at his opponent, he'd shattered one of his legs. In hindsight, he wasn't going to get back up after that leap, even if he had somehow won. He hadn't really been thinking that plan all the way through. Although, that implied he was even working with a plan at that point, and he himself wasn't even sure that he was. And finally, the last stage in his ceremony, probably the most laughable part about this entire routine he put himself through, he reached for the fridge door and retrieved one of the many bottles of water from within. It was all a ritual to acquire bottled water. If it wasn't for the fact that he had to do these things anyway, 𝐒𝐻𝐽 would have found it dramatic. Now, whenever he took off the castings that had kept him pinned for days, it felt natural and liberating to finally do something so trivial, so now he treated his ritual as his return to the world, to independence, and to his own self-inserted anxiety. He'd agreed to meet with Ashido in just a few hours. To be honest, he was still in a state of shock that the girl had asked him to meet with her so randomly. He'd not even begun to process the information being hurled at him before she'd turned heel and bolted out the train. His phone containing the girl's number, placed there herself, had been a jolt to the spine. He was amazed at himself for even agreeing to go. He was more amazed that he actually wanted to go. He barely knew Ashido, but what little he did know of her indicated to her being a fun-loving social person who he could talk to for hours about basically anything. He saw the energy she exhibited like someone saw steam from a kettle, and it was infectious. Being around her made 𝐒𝐻𝐽 take a keener interest in his surroundings, in the conversations he was involved in, and the people surrounding him. He knew that she was a friendly person, and he knew she had a pretty smile. A small blush painted its way across 𝐒𝐻𝐽's cheeks as he remembered this fact. These facts aside, he knew little about Ashido. And perhaps it was partly the reason why he actually wanted to go in with her. Of course, he'd rationalized it in his usual elaborate way, not that he was technically wrong. He and Ashido were both aiming to become heroes. It stood to reason they'd be working together for the years to come, regardless of whatever hero agency they ended up with. It would be valuable for the two of them to share a positive relationship, to understand one another, to minimize the risk to the people around them, and maximize their efficiency and teamwork. That was the correct answer to give, but he would be lying if he said he wasn't curious anyway. "Oh, 𝐒𝐻𝐽, you already took your castings off?" His mother's voice interrupted the quiet veil of the room, shooting him straight out of his thinking, and causing him to nearly choke on the liquid that was currently making its way down the green-haired boy's throat. Sputtering and coughing for just a few seconds, 𝐒𝐻𝐽 managed to calm himself down. He needed to take a few breaths to refill his lungs. "Geez, you surprised me," his mother apologized, glancing at him with an amused look on her face, as she began to collect the castings that 𝐒𝐻𝐽 had just left casually tossed around the table area. 𝐒𝐻𝐽 felt a quick pang of guilt for not cleaning up after himself, and he began to offer to clear them up himself, when he realized something. He hadn't actually mentioned Ashido to his mother in the slightest. For the most part, it had just slipped his mind entirely, and he hadn't even thought to tell her, instead focused on recovery, or reading what studying material he had available to him. Telling his mother about his plans for today had just totally nor occurred to him. He knew his mother would be worried about him, since he had only just removed the cast today, and she would prefer he remain at home and not go out alone. But he'd promised Ashido he would meet with her, and he intended to keep that promise. 𝐒𝐬𝐽 said, catching his mother's attention. He felt a small bead of sweat running from his forehead and down his cheek when his mother turned to face him with a soft smile, still with his medical bandages tucked under her arm. He still wanted to insist she give them to him to throw away, but at this point, she wasn't going to do that. He focused himself, however, on the actual statement he needed to make. I just thought I should probably mention, I'm going out with a classmate today. Understandably and predictably, his mother's face fell at these words. His mother was a very lenient person, and she never liked to restrict Izuku's freedom unless she felt there was literally no other choice. She was very much aware that the healer at Yui was very talented and skilled, and while she had total faith her son's leg was fine now, her worried nature still dominated a lot of her feelings regarding the matters. Are you sure that's a good idea, Izuku? I should be okay, my leg feels fine now. I promised that I'd show up, and I don't want to cancel and seem rude. He tried to make his voice sound as reassuring as he possibly could, to calm his mother's nerves. He knew her tendency to over-worry all too well. Throwing the 2-day-old supports into the garbage bin, his mother sighed and nodded. Be sure to be safe. I will be, don't worry. He gave her a smile, a comforting tug on the lips that he always gave her when trying to convince her that everything would be okay. He'd given her the same smile when he had left to take the entry exam for Yui, and the when he'd left the morning of the sports day festival. So, who is it that you're meeting with? Anyone I know? Izuku shook his head. No, I don't think so. Her name's Ashido-san. The inheritor of One for All suddenly couldn't help but feel uncomfortable with the look his mother suddenly gave him. A look of pure shock and something else he couldn't quite recognize that he assumed to be confusion. Of course, he'd never once mentioned Ashido-san to her, so confusion was understandable. He'd mentioned Ida and Uraraka many times, so she at least had an idea of who they were, but Ashido was a total unknown. And maybe you saw her throughout the sports festival broadcast. Izuku suggested, quickly running through the various appearance. She has pink skin and hair, sorta curly, a bit like mine. As he said this, he pointed at each one of the areas he was describing on his own body. When he mentioned her pink skin color, he ran his fingers along his cheek, and when he mentioned her hair, he flicked a tuft of his own away from his left eye. With no change in response from his mother, he kept going. Black eyes. He pointed at his own wide eyes, his sclera white, and his iris green. No reaction. Horns. For this, he grabbed 2 handfuls of his mess of a hairdo, and shaped them in as close a manner as he could get to resemble Ashido's horns. At this point, his mother's eyes began tearing up. And at the exact same moment, Izuku suddenly understood what was going through her head. His face exploded in a dark shade of scarlet, and he began to wave his arms in front of his face as quickly as they would physically go. And no, it's nothing like that. She just asked me if I wanted to go out, and not like a D-date go out, and I thought it would make sense since we're both trying to be heroes. I barely know her. Steam could practically be seen rising from the stuttering boy's skin as his body temperature begun to skyrocket at the mere implications. At no point previously had his mind even drifted towards that way of thinking. Now that it had entered though, he couldn't get that idea out of his head, which certainly didn't help when he had made his way to the Yui campus where he was to meet the pink girl. He had eaten a small amount of food and had a shower, during which he needed cold water desperately to cool him down with. His appetite had been totally shattered by his mother's overactive imagination, so he'd barely eaten more than a couple of spoonfuls of cereal before he was convinced that if he ate any more, his stomach would explode. His journey through the subway had helped him steel himself and calm himself down a bit more. He'd shoved the ideas to the back of his mind, and was determined to not let them creep back into the rest of his head for the rest of the day. If he'd managed to do that with Uraraka for the past few weeks, he could sure as hell manage it with Ashido for a day, right? As it turned out, he'd actually arrived a bit ahead of schedule, and as such, Ashido wasn't anywhere to be seen. Izuku made his way to the front gate, where they had agreed to meet. Time had been spent over the last few days repairing said gate from the effects of someone who had a quirk that let them destroy a reinforced steel barrier, probably that guy from the USJ, right? So excluding a few leftover work tools, the gate was pretty much back to normal. It was up, as it always was during the weekends, and even Izuku's student ID wouldn't help him get access. Safety reasons. The campus that he was outside of seemed to loom over him. When the school was open, and there were people going to and from, busy and working, the sight seemed too exciting, so interesting, and it reminded Izuku what a privilege it was to be able to attend such a well-renowned school, and made him thankful for every second of hard work he'd put in with all might to achieve his dream of attending this famous institute. But without his uniform, without anyone being here, and being surrounded in total silence, the walls that surrounded the school seemed larger, and the huge building seemed impossible to get to. It suddenly intimidated Izuku, and reminded him that this was the place the legendary heroes of modern society went to be molded into the people they are now. Someone without a quirk would have no chance here. Izuku, by default, shouldn't have had a chance here. At times, the green-haired boy felt like he was lying. Every second he spent in this school, felt like he was spitting at the examinees he'd beaten for his place here. People who had been born with their powers, who had done everything they could have done to get a place at UE. Those who didn't have All Might as their personal trainer, and those who hadn't inherited what could possibly be the strongest quirk on the planet. He knew that he'd earned his place here, fair and square, and he would never let anyone tell him otherwise. He'd refused to let Kaken even try to take this lifelong dream from him, even when he'd pinned him to a wall in an alleyway and burned a hole straight through his middle school uniform. He had earned this. This was his. But it didn't stop him from feeling that anyone else, literally anyone else, who had won for all could have made the cut. It almost felt like he was cheating. He sighed. The green and black jacket he'd put on began to catch wind, and his hair began to join it in dancing alongside the sudden gust of air that was pushing against him. What the heck had brought along this thought process? Wasn't he here for Midori? For the second time that day, Izuku was thrown out of his own thought bubble, and the rest of the world suddenly realigned itself. The walls around the hero school suddenly shrunk, and the wind came to a screeching halt. Izuku threw himself around and saw his classmate stood about half a meter away from him, with her eyes closed and her grin huge, showcasing her white teeth while she gave him the traditional Ashido smile. Ashido-san. Sorry I'm a little late. My brother hid my phone from me again. Didn't you get the message I sent you? Her voice was full of cheer and excitement, and as she spoke, she seemed to rise onto her toes, and then back down onto her heels again, making her look like she was bouncing on the spot. A message? Izuku quickly reached for his mobile phone and unlocked the device. There, awaiting him, was a short text, filled with abbreviations and emojis from the girl stood in front of him. It took him a couple of seconds to translate before he fully understood what the message was saying. At the end of the message was a less than 3 symbol and a number 3 just right of it. The combination of symbols for a love heart. Of course, the addition of the love heart caused everything Izuku thought he'd pushed to the back of his mind to burst right back into every aspect of his brain. Rational logic told him that Ashido was the sort of person who would send that to basically everyone she knew, and to calm the hell down, and Izuku heavily agreed with it, but irrationality outvoted both of them, and refused to let the UE student calm down. A blush made its way onto his face once again, leaving him to figure out the rest. Oh, it's fine, don't worry about it. You seem nervous. Ashido tilted her head slightly, and seemed to shift all her weight onto her left leg. She gave him a quizzical look, like she was trying to figure out what was going through her classmate's head. She reached out and tapped his skull with her knuckles lightly, so as not to hurt him. You didn't hurt your head against Todoroki, did you? No. Izuku shot his head out of Ashido's reach, and attempted to steal his nerves. Izuku. He took a deep breath and sighed. Sorry, you just surprised me. I was kind of lost in thought. What had become a worried expression suddenly melted, replaced with another soft smile on Ashido's face. My bad then. She chuckled to herself. It was only now that Izuku took note of what it was that Ashido had chosen to wear. For her torso, she had selected a black short-sleeve t-shirt, which had giant, bold, pink writing that covered her chest, which read acid. The shirt was a fairly loose article of clothing, exposing a fair amount of skin from the neck down, showing at least one collarbone. The neck hole seemed to lop to one side then the other, showing a fluorescent red strap, which 𝐒𝐿𝐴 dared not stare at for too long or question what piece of clothing it was owned by. The shirt seemed to expose a large amount of her biceps, barely even going up to her shoulders at all. Wrapped around her waist was a hoodie, gray in its color, which she had brought for in case the weather took a turn for the worse. Additionally, a pair of jean shorts that only went about halfway down her thoughts before cutting off far earlier than her school skirt would ever allow. A pair of long, black socks that reached just halfway up her lower leg covered her up a bit, but not by much. Lodged in her pocket was her phone. The only reason the boy was able to identify this was by observing a set of white earphones that left the pocket and found themselves wrapped around the back of Ashido's exposed neck. Looking between the two of them now is 𝐒𝐿𝐴, who had come in his usual green and black hoodie and a set of dark gray jeans, now seemed heavily overdressed. Or, Ashido seemed seriously underdressed, depending on your perspective. He knew Ashido was very casual when it came to her clothing. She was one of the only people who completely disregarded Yui's gray jacket and tie whenever she could get away with it, but this was a whole new level. Did she always dress like this? So, we gonna stand here all day, or are we gonna go do stuff? The girl suddenly asked, having walked past 𝐒𝐿𝐴 and making her way into the city, with a happy spring into her step as she put each foot in front of the other. 𝐒𝐿𝐴 couldn't stop himself from letting out a half-happy, half-embarrassed sigh. This was looking to be a long day, but not one he could say he was regretting signed up for. One thing he had to give Ashido due credit for was the sheer variety of places that she knew around Tokyo. 𝐒𝐿𝐴 had lived in this city for his entire life, even if he was in the more residential area, but Ashido was taking him to areas he never even knew existed. He'd been to the Nakano ward of the city before, but only fleetingly, while Ashido seemed to know everything about this ward inside and out. He had to wonder just exactly how much time did she spend just wandering around the city and getting her bearings on where everything was. Her zeal proved to have a practical use after all. Both of them had managed to engage in conversation once again, with 𝐒𝐿𝐴 managing to formulate sentences without tripping over and biting his own tongue. He was able to keep his stuttering to a minimum as the two of them spoke and explored. It was like they had talked on the train ride a few days ago, only with far more broad a palette of conversational subjects. Ashido brought up the subject of his arms and his leg, which he assured her were perfectly fine, if slightly numb even now. Normally, he never wanted to mention the ritual he acted out each time he got rid of those castings and bandages, but with Ashido he was able to casually talk about it, and smile when Ashido found herself unable to control her laughter. Not laughter directed at him, but rather with him. He couldn't even help himself chuckling at the absurdity that was his casting ritual. Ashido shared a few things about her home life, including her many siblings, and their unending quest to PSS her off. 𝐒𝐿𝐴 mentioned that he'd often wondered what life would be like with an older or younger sibling, to which his classmate assured him that it would be far, far more difficult. Eventually, they were able to toss questions back and forth, answering appropriately, and laughing at the various silly traits the other one had. One such question 𝐒𝐿𝐴 found himself asking was just how Ashido even knew about what there was to do in the Nakano ward. He brought it up casually, to fill in a lull in the conversation, as Ashido attempted to recall her way throughout this particular section of the city. Both were down on a bench out of the way of the passing commuters, when he asked, "I just sort of wandered in here one day and found all this cool stuff." It was a blunt but totally honest answer, and one 𝐒𝐿𝐴 couldn't say he hadn't seen jumped slightly when Ashido suddenly slammed her first into her open left palm. "Oh, I know. What is it? There's one of those old-school-style arcades not far from here. I have an idea." Before her classmate could question further, Ashido had grabbed hold of his wrist and was leading him through the crowded streets, and skillfully navigating their way through the hundreds upon hundreds of passers-by, somehow not managing to crash into one of them. 𝐒𝐿𝐴 had barely even had time to figure out that he was being dragged along before he suddenly found himself overwhelmed by loud noises, colorful lights, and blaring music. He almost felt like he was going to become deaf, blind, and photosensitive epileptic all at once. Filling the room were old arcade machines and a few slightly newer ones, but none of them were any younger than 20 years old, at the very least. Home entertainment systems had practically killed arcade machines, so it surprised 𝐒𝐿 that this place even existed. He couldn't deny his impress at the sheer number of the old devices here. Some were imported from American or German developers, and had terrible Japanese translations that bordered from functionally bad to downright hilariously awful. He'd only managed to come to his senses when he found himself being placed in front of a two-player machine that had two fairly large plastic guns in a metallic holster, located on his right-hand side, Ashido on his left. The game that she had apparently selected for them was called Time Bandits 2, a game the student had never even heard of. Challenge, Ashido declared, her fist suddenly punching the air above her, and a grin on her face that gave 𝐒𝐿 a bad feeling about this game. Person who gets the most points wins. The winner gets to make the loser do something whatever the winner's wants, just so long as it isn't dirty, K. She winked at 𝐒𝐿, which sent the boy into a red mess. Why, you're kidding, right? I don't even know how this thing works. Haven't you been to an arcade before, Midori? He hadn't. This was the first time he'd even come to such a place, and he had absolutely no idea how this sort of device even worked. He'd played a few video games, sure, but he wasn't exactly an active gamer. He'd play a few on his computer at home occasionally, but predictably, nearly all of them were hero-themed. He shook his head, indicating that he'd never done so before. It's easy. I'll explain it to ya. The pink girl pulled out the make-believe weapon from 𝐒𝐿's side of the machine, a plastic assault rifle, modeled after the American M16, and threw it at him. Catch. He tried, but instead, what should have been a smooth grab ended up being him missing the weapon at the last second, and awkwardly bringing the gun into a hug, the butt of the rifle smacking him in the face. Ashido just laughed. 𝐒𝐿 fumbled with the device, until he was holding it the right way, the shoulder guard pressed against his right shoulder, his finger around the trigger, and his left hand on the grip holder that was located further down the body of the weapon. Okay, it's real easy, Midori. Just point at the guy you want to shoot and pull the trigger on your gun. That sounded simple enough. The machine used motion detection software to track the movements of the rifle, and the trigger acted like a mouse button on a computer did, each pulling of the trigger being the equivalent to clicking the left mouse button to open up a new page. Okay, now, you see the metal bar by your feet? Looking down, 𝐒𝐿 saw what Ashido was referring to. It was a rectangular slab of metal with a foot inscription placed on it, shaped like that of a shoe. Multiple scratches across it indicated that the device had seen plenty of use over the course of its life. Yeah. You push on that with your foot to take cover. Take your foot off again to come out of cover. You avoid damage by taking cover, and the less damage you take, the more points you get. Got it? I think so. It sounded a lot more like a question than it did confirmation that 𝐒𝐿 had even the slightest idea what he was doing. It sounded simple enough, but for someone who barely even knew about video games, it might as well have been spoken to him terribly cheesy English that the game was apparently written in. Ashido inserted a few coins into the machine, and the starting screen faded and begun to play a small cinematic for a few seconds. From what little he was seeing, apparently the story was about either a drag cartel, a paramilitary, or a terrorist group. He honestly could not tell what they were supposed to be. Halfway through a line of dialogue though, Ashido must have gotten bored and triggered the cut to gameplay. They'd suddenly gone from being in a warehouse to brightly colored people shooting at them in the streets, and a car was being thrown at the two players. His floor slammed on the cover bar so hard for a second he thought he'd broken it. Ashido was already racking up points, and lighting up pretty much anything that came up on screen. She was letting out a continuous yell, alongside a grin. She didn't seem to think much in terms of making her character take cover, instead relying on speed and her impressive reflexes to just batter through basically anything that came at her. Tactics and actions that 𝐒𝐿 would expect from someone like Bakugo, but it seemed to be working here. Not wanting to lose the challenge that Ashido had declared, 𝐒𝐿 ran through what little he knew about the game. Point the gun at the enemies on the screen, and pull the trigger of the device in his hands. Avoid taking damage, and keep your score maximized. He took his foot off the pedal, and took a few shots at the nearest target. All of them completely missed, but it gave him a better idea on the sort of accuracy that the weapons had. They were slightly skewered in terms of their line of sight, which made the shots lean to the right by about 3 centimeters. This information gathered, 𝐒𝐬𝐽 slammed his foot on the cover bar again to avoid taking damage. By the time he'd done this, the camera of the game began to pan out onto the next area. Ashido had totally cleared the zone on her own. Her points were well over 1,000, while 𝐒𝐬𝐽 was still firmly on 0 points. At this rate, he was bound to lose. Deciding that he had to take action, he began to jump out of cover more and more, taking shots at whoever he could see, only firing off a few rounds before he ducked down again. His points began to slowly rise, catching up with Ashido's steadily. All of a sudden, half of the screen became BLD red, and a countdown timer began to count backwards from 10. DMN. Ashido muttered, and slammed the start button again with her other hand. 𝐒𝐬𝐽 quickly realized that she had taken too much damage and her character had run out of lives. This resulted in a point penalty, which cut her score in half. Their game continued like this for some time, 𝐒𝐬𝐽 playing tactically and being smart about what he did and when only firing in short bursts to avoid taking too much damage, while Ashido was just going full-on Rambo and kept losing all of the lives that they shared. When 𝐒𝐬𝐽 finally took too much damage, he wasn't able to revive his character, since Ashido had used up all 5 lives that they had. The final result revealed that, despite never having used one of these machines in his life, 𝐒𝐬𝐽 had won by about 2,500 points. He was as surprised as Ashido was, his mouth dropping when he realized that he'd utterly crushed her score, and then some. His score even got onto the leaderboards, placing in at rank 7. Diamond, nice work, Midori. Ashido whistled. Didn't expect that from you. Did you pick this game because you thought you'd have a home field advantage or something? 𝐒𝐬𝐽 questioned as he placed the device back into its place. A sly look from Ashido confirmed that she had indeed chosen the game expecting to utterly obliterate the awkward teenager. That's a little dishonest. He made a tone that couldn't decide if it was disappointed in Ashido's craftiness or amusement that he'd beaten her at her own game. Despite the ulterior motive for having picked this game, he wouldn't deny that he'd had a ton of fun. For one of the first times in his life, he didn't feel like weak, pathetic, quirkless Deku. He was just having fun. Well, a deal's a deal, Ashido said, stretching her arms forward. You beat me fair and square. What's your favor? Blinking twice, 𝐒𝐬𝐽 remembered the bet Ashido had declared that he'd never actually agreed to. He'd managed to forget about it during the rush of gameplay they had experienced. Since he was victorious, according to the rules set by his classmate, he had the power to ask Ashido to do one thing that she'd have to comply with. He had an idea on what he'd want but was unsure to ask of it. Was it really fair to ask her? 𝐒𝐬𝐽 was the kind of person who disliked the prospect of causing inconvenience to other people wherever he could help it, so a big part of him didn't want to ask, but, so you have to do whatever I ask. Just so long as you don't plan on taking advantage of me. Ignoring her comment, he bit his lower lip lightly. I kinda wanna dash. Before he could finish the statement he was making, both the ground and the floor began to shake, like an earthquake was going off, but to a far more limited degree. Lights dimmed and brightened periodically, and the metallic clanking of the decades-old machines could be heard as multiple people attempted to duck and cover. The sudden vibrations throughout the ground caught both the Yui totally unaware, and both of them lost their balance. 𝐒𝐬𝐽 was able to catch hold of the arcade machine that they had just been playing on to stop his fall, whereas Ashido was less lucky and wound up being knocked straight onto the floor. Ashido-san. 𝐒𝐬𝐽 disregarded the tremors, although they were now less violent than they had been just a few seconds ago, and went to help Ashido up, grabbing her hand and pulling her upright. Are you all right? I think so. Was that an earthquake? I don't think so. They normally last longer. The formerly quirkless boy disagreed with the suggestion of the pink girl. He took his hand from hers and bit down on his lower lip as he contemplated what possibilities existed. An earthquake was illogical since, by Tokyo standards, it was incredibly tame and lasted such a short frame of time, and he outlined construction work because they would have had to inform any people or establishments about the tremors so that they could warn their customers. Therefore, I think it might have been recoil from an impact of some kind. As he spoke, he was already making his way out the door to the arcade corner, wanting to get a better look at the effects that the quake had had on the streets. A scene not abnormal to Tokyo, but still a concerning one, awaited 𝐒𝐿 and Ashido once they threw the doors to the game's corner aside. In their society, people who had no idea how to control their quirks, the mentally unstable or just the plain crazy, would occasionally lash out at their fellow citizens, causing untold damage to the city and the population. This was just another example of a person letting loose with their powers, not at all an uncommon thing in the country's capital city. This one was a bit different, however. 𝐒𝐿 recognized the aggressor. That day that he and Ashido had been on the train together, he had been casually browsing his phone's news application whenever there was a lull in the conversation. One of those articles had focused on a villain who had eluded capture from the heroes and villain custody force due to a quirk that made his body into grass and allowed its user to control said plant life, extending his limbs and using them to enwrap objects around him, constrict them, and various other uses that such an unusual ability would allow. The media had taken to calling him 𝐿. And right now, he was going on an absolute rampage. For what reason that was, 𝐒𝐿 couldn't guess, but the reason wasn't important. What was important was the fact a grassman was totaling a street right in front of him and Ashido. That was the issue here. The villain had an eerie arrangement of dead grass and bright, very much alive grass intertwined and sticking out, creating one of the most terrifyingly creepy smiles that either of the students had ever seen. The limbs he had were flexible and apparently incredibly strong, despite inherently having no muscle structure whatsoever, as he was able to lift a car into the air and toss it aside like a toy rattle for a young child, and seemed to have about as much difficulty as one. Said car wound up through the window of an apartment complex which was, hopefully, uninhabited at the current time. Come and get me, heroes. Either the guy was escaping heroes, could not handle the power his quirk gave him, or he was completely insane. Those were the only options 𝐒𝐿 was seeing here. There was one detail in this scene that led the hero admirer to the latter conclusions. There wasn't a single hero to be seen anywhere. Everyone was either running away in a blind panic, had already gotten away in the initial rush, was hiding, or was the villain. As far as 𝐒𝐿 could tell, the closest people to heroes here were him and Ashido. Midori. Suddenly, Ashido's voice interrupted the analyzing student, breaking him out of his observations. He could tell by the look on her face that she was uneasy about the current situation, which was understandable. Anyone who had no experience with villains would be terrified, and rightly so. But they had. She wasn't scared but uncomfortable. He'd pulled him behind a car, keeping them out of the line of sight of the destructive plant creature. We should go, let the pros deal with this guy. A part of 𝐒𝐿 did agree. This guy in particular seemed to be in possession of an extraordinarily strong quirk, and to top that off, he was just lashing out, which indicated towards mental instability or quirk mentality. Against someone like this, their chances weren't exactly great. Not to mention, without an official source allowing them to act, they could be tried as criminals for acting outside the law. But the bigger part of the green-haired altruist refused. There aren't any pros nearby, and I don't think they're gonna be able to get here before this guy hurts someone. Finding his hand had already made a fist, he realized that once again, this was a case of his body having made the move before his brain had even sent the signal to it. He'd already had his course planned out before he'd even thought of a plan. He slipped himself out of his jacket, tossing it to the side of the pavement where it hopefully wouldn't get damaged. What are you suggesting we do something about this? Shock evident in the girl's voice, mixed with disbelief, and just a hint of admiration. How the heck would we even do anything? His body's made up of grass and plant life. As 𝐒𝐿 said this, the villain 𝐿 lashed out at a nearby gaggle of civilians, just narrowly scratching one of them with a blade of grass that could be called his left hand. His body constricts, and lets him extend up to 10 meters in the moments his body's extended. The rest of his body is acting like a spring, straining meet the requirements to allow the body to stretch the way it does. If there was an additional force applied to that spring, or something weaken the body, it wouldn't be able to hold its form. It'd either try or it would snap. He muttered basic physics to himself as he revised what his options were. He had one for all, and Ashido had her acid. He had a plan, but Ashido, in the heat of the situation, he completely forgot to add the 𝐿 to the end of her name. I have an idea, but I need you to help. Just tell me what you need. I trust you. Ashido nodded, letting him know that she was ready to help him out. If I use my quirk, there's a huge risk I'll damage myself. Since this guy has a plant-like body, any damage I do to that state could be absorbed, or he could at least negate most of it. So I'd be out of commission and I wouldn't have been able to do anything. The sound if another car shattering into another window, this one far closer to their location, made Izuku press the matter faster. I need you to hit the guy with your acid, as much as you can. Doesn't matter where, I just need you to weaken him. Once you do that, I should be able to hit him and make it count. Okay. There wasn't any hesitation in her voice, nor was there any worry. She meant it. She trusted Izuku. She trusted that this plan would work, because from what she'd seen, and what she knew of him, he wouldn't let her down. She built up acid in her palms, small droplets dripping from his fingers and eroding into the tarmac road. Plan ready, and the pieces put together, Izuku peeked at the grass villain, who he found himself referring to by his media name in his head. 𝐻𝐻𝐿 was smashing a hole into a wall of some description, belonging to what looked to be an advertising company. Insane then. All right, regardless of that, he was distracted. It was a good time to attack. Okay, Ashido. Quickly go now. Despite what her appearance may deceive someone to think, Ashido was, in actuality, rather fast on her feet, even without the use of her quirk. Her legs were toned, a clear result of her hours upon hours of exploring every nook and cranny of everything around her with her contagious enthusiasm and curiosity. Combine that with her ability to utilize her acid in a manner similar to that of ice skating, and she could take off like a bullet, even without a running start. She'd kicked off the shoes and socks she'd worn, and made a beeline straight for 𝐻𝐻𝐿, her arm practically covered in her highly corrosive liquids. Unfortunately, she wasn't in the least bit camouflaged. Her clothing helped, but bright pink against the grays of the urban landscape did nothing but contrast, making her incredibly easy to spot to someone with even limited peripheral vision. 𝐻𝐻𝐿 spotted her coming about 3 seconds after she darted out of cover. Since her quirk was equally as unsubtle, the villain was quickly able to deduce her goal. He wasn't mentally stable, but that didn't make him stupid by any stretch of the imagination. Not happening, Pinky. Ashido. Izuku called out, already running out of cover to follow her. On your right. Reflexes akin to a cat, Ashido's eyes shot in the called direction, to see 3 separate vines, all dark green in their coloring, approaching her at high speeds. The girl reacted quickly, her arm throwing an uppercut filled with acid at the vines. Upon contact, they withered away and died, dissolving into nothingness. Not that the barrage ended with those 3. Next up came a salvo from up front, with more vines coming each with a different target, 1 for the head, another for the arm, and 2 for each of her legs. It was now a display of skill for Ashido, whom ducked deep when one came swinging for her head, and skidded right underneath it like a high-speed game of limbo. Skiing left, she avoided a swipe for her arm and then leaped up high, avoiding the collective 4 vines trying to trip her up, and as she gained height, she managed to use her momentum to perform a backflip midair, while still building up a concentration of growingly corrosive acid. Izuku had to give full credit, that was incredible. Her hand was now full of the dangerous substance her body secreted from her skin, and as she fell, she threw the acid at 𝐻𝐻𝐿, at the fullest force her body could muster. Her hit ended up injuring the main meet-up point of all the grass, so it had to be the body. The reaction she got from the villain made her grin in satisfaction, for a few brief, glorious seconds. Go, you little beach. Those short but sweet moments were cut short by a vine striking out, slamming itself right into Ashido's stomach with the force of a baseball bat. The strike knocked the air right out of her, causing her to 𝐔𝐬𝐬 before being propelled down the street, tossed aside like a rag doll. Ashido. Izuku wanted to stop charging, to activate One for All, to spring to grab her, and to make sure she was okay, but he knew unless he fulfilled his part of the plan, their efforts would have been an absolute waste. She'd cleared the path for him, she'd done her job, more than he could have asked her to do. He had to make sure that this work didn't go to waste. Moving as fast as his legs would allow him to, Izuku darted past the vines that attempted to rectify themselves, to no avail. He followed the acid trail Ashido had left for him, even leaving him a cleaned route to follow, before he would up right next to 𝐻𝐻𝐻𝐻, the rampaging madman not noticing him until it was too late to do anything about the boy. DMN. The power began to surge straight through Izuku's body, the feeling of 8 wielders of this awesome power adding their own strength into the mix, combined with his own physical prowess, run straight through the veins of his left arm. The sheer power tore apart the left side of his t-shirt, causing a huge tear from his armhole to his neck hole, revealing his impressive array of muscles. No time to focus in on his finger. This was all or nothing. His brain screamed at him. He steeled himself, his open palm reaching, and by just a hair, he felt his middle finger, his longest finger, press against the grassy body of 𝐻𝐻𝐻𝐻. Oregon, his arm was now straining against the distance between him and his limb as he took a step forward. With a final yell, he swung him arm around, like he was throwing a hook, only with an open hand. Izuku roared the name of the technique he used, mimicking all might to a rather accurate degree, and forced every inch of the power he could muster to expel from his hand and send a ginormous shockwave into the villain's body. The grassy body was not dealt to deal with such sheer power from such a quirk. With his body weakened thanks to the effects of Ashido's quirk, the spring analogy came full in its entirety, as the body that 𝐻𝐻𝐻𝐻 had simply could not withstand the impact. Much like a spring, his body snapped and exploded, sending mulch and compost-like remains everywhere, along the roads, stuck to the sides of buildings, and the grassy limbs that once made up 𝐻𝐻𝐻𝐻's main attacking methods slumped down, leaving Izuku the only one standing. It stung, but Izuku's arm hadn't broken, and how this was, he couldn't even begin to guess. The first time had been at the USJ, and it had happened again against Todoroki, and now here he didn't focus on this fact for too long, only noticing it when a gust of cold wind shot up the left side of his body. One of the green-haired boy's favorite shirts now was essentially ripped in two, but he didn't care right now. He looked around rapidly, before he spotted the girl he was supposed to be here with. Ashido-san. She'd propped herself up against a wall, clutching her stomach. She was winded, but there wasn't anything majorly wrong with her. Looking at her classmate, she was able to smile and give him a breathless thumbs up. Izuku skidded to a halt next to her, to see what was wrong with her, the concern for her clear in the actions he took, the ways his face was, and how gentle he was when he placed his hand on her shoulder. Ashido-san, are you all right? I'm fine, Midori, just a little. Hard to breathe right now, she struggled to keep up her chipper attitude, but she did so with a brave face indeed, still showing a pained grin. What was a surprise to her, and she made sure she took note of it, because hot, was that Midori was freaking well built. With his shirt half destroyed, she was able to glimpse at about half his torso and chest since he hadn't bothered to cover them up before making his way over here. She knew that he was stronger than he appeared, and while she accepted that, she had no idea that he was this well-toned. He was freaking. The sheer number of muscles that he had, and that he somehow still managed to look so innocent, so universally bland, otherwise it marked the first time all day Ashido had genuinely blushed. I just need a minute. She took advantage to sketch the image of this into her mind, because holy, was this something she needed to remember, if only to remember what the physical personification of contrast was. As the two spoke, Izuku trying to help Ashido to her feet, and Ashido still trying to fill her lungs with much-needed oxygen, they hardly paid any attention to the remains of 𝐻𝐻𝐻𝐻, the dirt, the compost, and the grass, all moving, recollecting itself into one pile, not too far away from the location of the young students. Small bit by bit, the villain's body began to repair itself, each segment coming back to life with each chunk of mud and dirt that joined the amalgamation of grass and compost. Neither of them noticed before they were in a position to not do anything about it. You sure you're all right? Izuku asked as he and Ashido walked, allowing her to have her arm wrapped around his neck to use as support. Normally, this would have embarrassed him to no end, but with the adrenaline still pumping, he was numb to it, instead focusing in getting a regular breathing pace going again. I'm fine, don't worry. Ashido told him for the third time with a small laugh, amused by the concern he was showing. You should worry. The rebuilt corpse of 𝐻𝐻𝐻𝐻 burst from its hiding spot, having fully repaired the damage previously done to it. The quirk 𝐻𝐸𝐽𝐲 had was called compost, which allowed his body to act in a way similar to that of a sentient pile of said quirk, including the ability to not be defeated by simply being shredded apart. Now, he towered above Izuku and Ashido, his body fixed, and his weapons primed. He came crashing down upon them, ready to rip them apart, limb from limb. The pair looked on in abject horror when they saw the incoming attack, with no way of dodging, or getting out of the way, or countering in time anymore. 𝐻𝐸𝐽𝐲 was in just too close. What now, you little bastards? Had he been 1 second earlier, he would have crushed the two of them. Lacquered chains prison. A split second later, a huge slab of perfectly refined wood began to entrap 𝐻𝐸𝐽𝐲, suddenly bursting out from each and every direction around the plant-type quirk user. Shooting his vines in all directions, hoping to make some sort of escape, was a desperate last bid for freedom, but not one that proved to be fruitful in the slightest. The vines were utterly crushed, stopping any prayer that they had of grappling the now totally trapped villain away to safety. Unauthorized use of quirk during the work hours, endangering of civilians, and huge damage to public property. A hero Izuku recognized, who he would have previously begun to gush over, revealed himself from behind the newly created wooden prison. 𝐒𝐻𝐢𝐽𝐳, the young and relatively new hero who had already built up a huge name for himself for his tenacity and dedication to the public good when Izuku first saw him in action. Over the past year, he had continued to cement his name in the minds of the citizens of Tokyo. He threw an insult to 𝐻𝐸𝐽𝐲 while he was trapped. You make me feel disgusted at myself for even sharing a plant-type quirk with you. Their knees weak from relief, Izuku and Ashido both collapsed to their knees once again. That had been close. Way too close. In spite of that, Ashido was able to laugh, while still letting tears of sheer relief roll down her cheeks. How she was able to keep her spirits so high amazed Izuku, who couldn't help but join her in her laughter. You two kids all right? The lumber quirk user asked, as he separated his body from the prison he had made, leaving 𝐻𝐸𝐽𝐲 to be taken away as soon as the villain custody force arrived. Now, he would do damage control, and make sure the civilians around him were okay, starting with the two right in front of him. We're fine, thank you. Izuku would have bowed to show his gratitude, but had to settle with nodding his head, since he couldn't stand upright. Ashido gave a thumbs up to the pro hero, signifying her well-being. Normally, 𝐒𝐻𝐢𝐽𝐲 would have left it at that, instructing them to vacate the area and seek medical attention if required. But he recognized Izuku, and was suddenly armed with a list of questions as long as his lumber quirk would reach. You again? You're that kid who ran at the sludge villain a year ago, aren't you? I would have thought you'd learned your lesson after that, but apparently you've started making a habit of it. 𝐒𝐻𝐢𝐽𝐲 would have torn into Izuku right then and there, berating him on how civilians, especially ones who lacked any power whatsoever, shouldn't be charging at villains they would only endanger their lives against by trying to stop them, but this was before he noticed the tear in Izuku's shirt, the vary of muscles, and a slight bruise to his arm. What happened to your arm? Were you injured? Izuku followed the pro hero's line of sight, and shook his head. This is from my own quirk. 𝐒𝐻𝐢𝐽𝐲 suddenly cocked a lodge of wood around his eye up, to look like he was raising a quizzical eyebrow at the stuttering boy. He had a very good memory, and he remembered the day that Izuku had charged at the sludge villain well. Though he had been on rescue duty, keeping the civilians safe from the flames let loose by Bakuga's explosions, he had joined the other heroes in berating Izuku for his foolhardiness, and he remembered what Izuku had answered when asked exactly. I thought you said you didn't a quirk? CRP. Izuku shot a glance towards the classmate knelt by him, who was looking at him with a look he couldn't describe. Confusion. Intrigue. Damnation. Pity. He didn't know. But this was bad. I meant that I couldn't use my Q quirk. Since if I did, I would have just injured myself. I didn't want you heroes to have to worry about me being injured and in your way, even if I sort of was in your way anyway, but, okay, alright, okay. 𝐒𝐻𝐢𝐽𝐲 looked around the area, seeing the damage caused, not a single doubt that it was all caused by the villain he had just imprisoned, judging by how many vines, blades of grass, and leaves covered the area of impact. Yet on closer inspection he was able to see the effects of Ashido's quirk, melted tarmac, droplets eroded holes around the place, and singed cars. Had these two not interfered, the damage could have been worse, and 𝐂𝐚𝐲 knew this perfectly well. Technically, I should be arresting both of you for acting without a provisional license, but considering that the damage would have been worse if you didn't act, I'm willing to let this slide, but you should leave the area immediately. This is now a crime scene. The warning to leave before more pro-heroes or the police showed up came clear as crystal to both Izuku and Ashido, whom thanked the man quickly, and once Izuku had run to grab his jacket so as not to be wandering the streets exposing half of his torso, dashed off into the crowds of Tokyo, blending in with the rest of society, whom would never know what they had just done, and how a hero had let them get away with it. There wasn't really a way to go back to normal after what they had just gone through an hour earlier. They tried to continue as they would have, Ashido showing Izuku a few more places around this particular section of the largest metropolitan city in the world, but the reality was, neither of them could get into it that much. After fighting a villain, narrowly avoiding arrest because they ran into one of the few pros who would let them get away with it, everything else throughout the day felt just less exciting, less impressive, just less. To Ashido's credit, she still tried, announcing the names of stores and locations that could only be matched if fanfare was released each time she spoke. And Izuku did try to be enthusiastic. He listened to what she had to say about each store and site, and he did whatever Ashido suggested, but neither of them could really muster the real energy for it. By the time they had decided that maybe it was time to call it a day, it was about 5 in the afternoon. They'd spent a collective 4 hours together, and ran into the villain by the second. At least it was an even split between genuine enjoyment and a forced march to try and go back to normal. Both of them made their way to the subway station once again, where Ashido declared her intention to go with Izuku to his stop before catching the train from their back home. Their spirits raised a bit, they were able to at least laugh about the villain encounter a little. Organ smash. The pink girl loudly yelled, mimicking Izuku's move. To an outsider, she looked like an All Might admirer who wasn't afraid to flaunt her obsession with her idol, even if that wasn't the truth here. Huh. You copied All Might for that move, didn't you? I just thought it would work, Izuku nervously laughed. Don't be modest, Midori. Even if you did steal All Might's move, it was still awesome. I didn't steal it. You sound defensive for someone who didn't steal anything. No wage. Hearing that name, that demeaning name from anyone other than Uraraka, filled Izuku with dread, replacing the joy he was feeling. He recognized that voice, even if he hadn't heard it for a few months. He'd hoped he wouldn't hear it from any of those voices again, dealing with it from Bakugo was bad enough. Turning his head to face them, sure enough, there the two of them were. Two of the worst culprits of his bullying throughout middle school. Hidakura Kokiha and Yuhando Komori. Both were dressed in the same school uniform, them both attending a school that was locally found around this ward of Tokyo. A step down to their goals of entering UI. That was definitive. Their clothing was nearly all black, not too unlike their middle school ones. Hidakura's hair was still a black mess of a do, bordering curly and spiky at the same time, and from what little glance Izuku could get, his teeth still sharper than kitchen knives. Yuhando's blonde, straight hair was still parted on both sides, keeping his lazy-looking eyes clear, and his massively extended fingers still swayed side to side, as was his habit. Both of them, along with Bakugo, had been the absolute hell of Izuku growing up. Had he lived an ideal life, Izuku would have never run into the two of them again, for as long as he lived, and even beyond that if possible. Holy 𝐒𝐬𝐽𝐽. Yuhando was clearly as surprised as Hidakura was, his eyes wider than they normally were. He waved over to the green-haired former classmate, in a manner that could even be considered friendly. Hey, Deku over here. Izuku shot glances between the two, and then to Ashido, who was looking confused, and rested her hand on her now cocked-up hip. He didn't want this to become an issue, a concern, anything that involved Ashido in something that she didn't need to be involved in. He bit the bullet, swallowed hard, and made the most awkward motion that could be considered a wave he'd ever done in his life. Hi guys. They friends of yours? Ashido asked. Old classmates? He replied. These people were in his friends. Right now he was steeling himself for one of the most horrible encounters of the day. Could he go back to overgrow? he'd prefer dealing with. Overgrow. Both the students walked over and proceeded to playfully punch Izuku's shoulders, which did make him very clearly flinch, but the action left him feeling very, very confused. Hidakura laughed, his sharp-tooth quirk making the sharp teeth I drew had look blunt in comparison. Huh, still jumpy as ever. I guess so. You actually got into Yui with Bakugo, didn't you? Yuhando inquired, one of his extended fingers going past Izuku's shoulder and pointing towards Ashido. That where the girl's from? I feel like I recognize her, I'm right here, you know? Ashido responded, not impressed that she was just being completely overlooked in the conversation. Bad enough she hadn't been introduced, worse still that they hadn't thought to speak to her when she was right there. Yes, I'm from Yui. Ashido Mina. I'm one of Midori's classmates. Midori. Hitsukura smirked at the nickname and muttered something quietly to Izuku. Ding, first you get into Yui, and next time we see you, you've got a girl. I underestimated you, det. That is not what this is. Izuku insisted furiously, pushing past the two of his former classmates, convinced that this was some sort or plan to mess with him. Ashido-san, if we don't hurry we're gonna miss our train. Although she honestly had no clue what was even going on anymore, she took the hint and quickly made her way around the two teenagers and rejoining Izuku's side. They would have been able to get away, and Izuku would have quickly begun answering any and all questions, far away, that he knew Ashido would be armed with, if he hadn't been called back. Hey Deku. Why I'm sorry. The pause. Izuku blinked twice, processing what he just heard Hidakura say to him. This actually caused him to turn a full 180 degrees to see the sharp-tooth quirk user with his head bowed, Yuhandoe also lowered in what he could only describe as shame. Words weren't coming to Izuku's brain. Communication suddenly became lost to him, and he had no idea how to speak. What for? Middle school. Bakugo. I'm sorry. What we did wasn't right. We shouldn't have been such jerks to you just 'cause you were quirkless. We saw you during the sports festival, and you were freaking awesome, and we're stuck in some garbage high school a few miles from here, while you're at U. Plus, your quirk is awesome. I dunno why you wouldn't use it against us. I kinda wish you had done. Yuhando added on. We were terrible to you. Really we're sorry. Maturity. A willingness to accept their faults, and a longing to apologize for what they had done made Izuku honestly forget everything that they had done to him. He just really wished Ashido hadn't heard that. The look she gave him made him sweat buckets, and he stammered, bit his own tongue, and forced out whatever sentences he had to get this topic the hell out of her head. It's totally fine. Do not worry about it really. But we really do have to get going now. Bye. He grabbed Ashido by the wrist and began sprinting away from his former classmates, leaving them totally bewildered. I thought you didn't have a quirk. We shouldn't have been such jerks to you just 'cause you were quirkless. These sentences rung through Mina's head over and over and over, like a gong had just gone off in her head. Izuku hadn't spoken a single word since he'd grabbed her by the wrist and began to lead her away. She knew something wasn't right, and she wanted to know what it was. But at the same time, she knew it wasn't her business. If Midoriya has things he wanted to keep secret, then it was his right to keep them secret, but no. Mina wanted to know. She wanted to know why her friend was lying to her. Waiting until there was no one around, Mina ripped her wrist from Izuku's grip. Oh. Sorry, Ashido-san, I've been dragging you all this time, huh? I'm really sore. Midoriya? Mina firmly stated his full name. Izuku froze. What had happened to Midori? I didn't want to bring it up since I didn't think you were comfortable with the subject, but Midoriya, I need you to explain something to me. Bakugo. Those two people who you used to go to school with, why did they all call you quirkless? I mean, you clearly have a quirk, and it's a freaking incredible one. His eyes widened, and his heart slammed against his chest faster. CRP. I can understand Kamui thinking you were quirkless. Your reasons for not using your quirk in that sludge monster thing. That's a whole other question, but that logic was solid. I never understood why Bakugo called you a quirkless runt. Every time someone even brings up your quirk, he goes ballistic. But again, I accepted that because you'd know him for years. I just assumed you never showed him, and he thought your quirk was just having 6 toes or something, but your old classmates, they apologized for bullying you when you were quirkless. Looking at her now, Izuku could see that Mina wasn't judging him. She wasn't making fun of him. She was genuinely, honestly hurt. It looked like tears had been stung with the droplets of tears, shimmers once again in her black 𝐒𝐻𝐽𝐻, but this time from sadness. What had caused such concern? Why did she care so much? And when I think about how strange your quirk is, how it breaks you when you use it, how you avoid using it whenever you can, like it's a last resort, but how it sometimes works. We're friends, aren't we, Midoriya? He blushed lightly, but he nodded. He liked to think he was a friend to everyone in Class 1A. He wanted to be friends with everyone there. He was even fully prepared to be the shoulder Bakugo cried on if he ever needed it. He liked Ashido, and he did consider her to be a friend. Then please, what's going on? He could lie. And he knew that really he should lie to her. To insist that he'd just hidden his quirk, that Bakugo was telling the truth when he said he'd hidden it from the explosive boy and every one of his classmates. To insist that his quirk just naturally broke his bones, and that was why he didn't use it as leisurely as everyone else in their class did. To turn back around and walk away. But he didn't want to. Ashido was stood right there, and had asked him the question that no one else had, and was doing it with tears in her eyes, despite barely even knowing the guy. She was showing such real care for him, and wanted to know the truth about Midoriya Izuku. She'd know he was lying if he did. And he doubted that she'd forgive him if he did. And part of him wanted to tell her. He was tired of hiding this secret from other people, tired of having to lie about the origins of his power. He hated doing it. He felt dirty every single time he lied through his back teeth to his friends, to his mother, to every single person he met. But he'd promised All Might. The person who this power belonged to. The person who had given him the ability to achieve the dreams that had been out of reach, unattainable, for so long, the man he admired and respected. His hero. And he wouldn't break that promise. He found himself torn between the man who was the symbol of what Izuku wanted to become, and the girl in front of him who was begging to know. He couldn't tell her the truth, but he wouldn't lie to her either. The truth is, when I applied for UE, I did actually think I was quirkless. In fact, no, I quirkless. When Mina looked up at him, he continued.